All right, you guys. Now it's time to get our programs to start making decisions for us and responding to user input and also validating user input. So if we ask for a name or address or something, we want to make sure they put stuff in the text boxes before we go ahead and process it. Now this little app looks very, very simple, but I've added some things to it to make it a little more interesting for you. First of all, if you click on the OK button and you don't put in any information, a little message box is going to come up and say, hey, please enter your name. So they can't get past that. So we're going to validate that. I put the blinking cursor back in here. So if I just put in somebody's name and then hit OK, now it's going to give them a little message. We're going to concatenate their name and put an OK message. Okay, so we've done this before, but we haven't validated the text box. So I'm going to show you how to do that with decision structures called if statements. And in C# there's really a couple. There's the if statement component, and then there is something called a switch. And I'm going to show you both in this particular lesson, not in this video, but in this particular lesson. So when you hit OK and the message box goes away, there you are. Now the other thing I want to show you is this. When you hit quit, now we're going to be able to confirm whether or not they want to actually quit or exit. And I talk about this in terms of being able to get an answer back from Mr. Message Box. And in this case, you'll notice we didn't just put in an OK button. I told it to make a yes or no. If they click no, then I have another little message come up here to harass them a little bit. Okay. And this time, if they click this and they say yes, then finally the program ends. Now, one thing you didn't see that I added is this. When you first run the application, it has some code in there to make sure that your computer is connected to the network. If it is, it gives you this friendly message. If it's not, it'll tell you your device is not connected. Now for this particular app, it has nothing to do with the network, but I wanted to show you how you could use a different namespace inside the framework that isn't included in our default form. It doesn't come in with the using namespaces that you see on the screen up there. I want to show you how you can access some of these features very easily, really, once you know where they are, so that you can do this kind of stuff yourself. Okay, because if you had an app that required internet, you'd definitely want to know this. So let's quit this baby and let's take a look at some of the code. So in this particular one, it's been changed to Visual Studio 2015 with a framework of 4.5. I'm going to show you how to check for network connectivity. We're going to validate user input, and we're going to do a confirm delete. I also want to show you something cool called regions. And if you look down here, you'll see that what I did was I sort of compartmentalized all my code into what are called regions, and that's what these little boxes are. When you open them, like this is for our constructor, this is for the form load event, and the OK button. Normally this is what you see on the screen, but I have found that when you're working on something, it's very easy to type in the wrong place and it's very easy to get confused. So after you get something working, it's kind of nice to be able to just close it up in its own little region and then work on the stuff that you're doing. And I just wanted to show it to you because I think you will like them. Most students find them very, very helpful. First thing I want to do is I want to teach you how to check to see if the network is up. And what I wanted to do was, you'll notice as soon as I hit F5, it came up and did this. So anytime you want to execute something before the form is actually visible, you notice that this came up before the form. You usually put it in what's called the form load event, and in order to make an event handler for the form load event, you simply find a blank place on the form. I typically tell students double click on the caption, and you double click on it just like you would a button, and it makes what's called the form load event. Now I think we've looked at this before, but bears a little bit of repeating. And remember that any code in here that runs will run before the form is loaded. Now before I show you this, because this has a little bit of complexity, I want to show you the simple one under the OK button. So I made an event handler for the OK button, and what I want to do here is show you how to check a text box to make sure it's not empty. There are some rules that we use when you work with if statements. First of all, when you want to do an if statement, what you're really asking the computer is, would you please evaluate whatever I put inside these parentheses? If it's true, then I want you to execute the very next line of code or the next lines of code, that block of code. If this is false, I don't want you to execute this. I want you to come down here and execute this block of code. Now what I'm showing you is what is called an if-else block statement. You need to know first of all that all this else stuff is completely optional. If I took this out and ran it, it would work just fine. The problem is it would only have one message. And if the text box was empty, I wouldn't be able to tell them, hey, put your name in there. So I typically have a situation like this when I do a yes/no scenario. I'm going to say, if this is true, run this block of code. If it's false, run this block of code. Okay? But sometimes you don't use the else, but I find it very, very helpful. Here are some of the rules. Whatever you type in the parentheses here after the if statement, and you'll notice it's all lowercase, this is going to end up, from the computer's point of view, of being just a true or false decision. That's all. Is X greater than 10? Is the network running? Yes or no? That's all you're asking for with these if statements. Now you'll notice how I checked a text box. This is not the only way to check a text box, but it's kind of a simple way to do it. I'm going to say if txtname.text is not equal. Now not equal is, you use the what's called the bang operator. That's the exclamation point. A bang and a equal sign means not equal. So if you haven't used it before, write that down. If it's not equal to string.empty, now this is a very simple way of finding out if there's anything in the text box, and that's all I cared about. Later on we'll learn how to validate the text box, make sure they put in letters and not some bunch of numbers or something, but that's a different kind of a process. Here I just want to make sure there's something in there. If in fact it's not empty, then go ahead and show a message box and say hi there, and I just concatenated their name. Now the first rule in using these blocks in if statements is this. If you're only going to have one command or one statement, in this case, after the if statement like I have here, you don't need to use the little parentheses, or the braces rather, and I put a note there for us. Okay, let me move this out of the way. When you only have one instruction in this block of code, you don't have to use the parentheses. However, look down here. If they didn't put anything in the text box, this is going to evaluate to false. The computer's going to say, nope, there's nothing in there. So it's not going to pay any attention to this block. It's going to come down here to my else block. If this is true, great. Otherwise, do this. That's how you should look at this. But the difference between this block up here and this one is I have two statements. First one says show a message box that says, hey, please enter your name. And the second line is we're going to set the focus right there. Okay, and obviously I don't need to have this there. That was a mistake when I was copying and pasting. Okay, so it just says, hey, please enter your name. And then it sets the focus back to that text box. Because I have two statements, 1, 2, I must use these curly braces to define that block of code. All right, up here you don't have to, but I could, and often I do, just because to me it looks a little cleaner and it helps me keep track of stuff. Okay, so don't be shocked if you see in my block of code I use these all the time, but you don't have to, and that's what I want to point out to you right now. I'm going to get rid of them so you don't get confused by it. Okay, notice one last thing. After this if statement, there is no semicolon. You only use a semicolon at the end of a line where you're asking the computer to do something, not evaluate something. So these are much more like, hey, do something, make this happen, and that's when you mark the end of the line. Okay. Up here we're just saying, hey, I want you to evaluate this. Don't put a semicolon there. If you do, it won't run the way you think it's going to run at all. Okay, so make sure you look at that code, make sure you kind of understand it, make sure you read it in your book. If statements are absolutely everywhere and you need to know how they work. You can also say, hey, if this is not empty, then do this. Otherwise, you can say else if, do this, else if, do this, else if, do this. You can have multiple tests or check multiple scenarios. Okay. Now let's take an example similar to that, but in this case on the quit button, I want to get an answer back from Mr. Messagebox. So I'm going to move this up here and see if I can show you all of this on one screen. I kind of think I will. Now, when you want to get a message box to give you an answer back, you're going to put in the normal message box show, are you sure? That's my question. I put in a caption of system message, and then when you pick your message box button, make sure you put yes, no. If you put okay, then they're not going to be able to answer yes, no. I also used a question icon, but you notice all of this message box junk that we've done before is inside of this big if statement. If statements always have to have parentheses, rounded parentheses. So it's going to say if messagebox.show, and it looks a little funny when you read it that way, but notice what we do. I put down here with a question mark at the end down here, and still within the parentheses. I'm going to make this a little smaller so you can get it on screen. I'm going to say if messagebox.show, are you sure? The system messagebox button yes, and a question mark. If that is equal to a dialog result yes, then go ahead and close the app. Now let me explain something. All message boxes in Windows now are treated as what are called dialog boxes. The most common dialog box that I have seen is something like this. That's more like a dialog box, or something when you open up My Computer and you see stuff, or the properties of My Computer, and you want to look for something. That's my idea of a dialog box, but now they call the message box out. So what we're doing when we say this, we're going to say if this is equal, and notice two equal signs. Two equal signs means we're doing a test. If you have one equal sign, that means you're assigning something. Say num items equals 1, x equals 5. That's when you use one equal sign. Two is when you're testing to see if something is equal to something else. If it's equal to dialog result dot yes, that means they click the yes button. That means they want to quit. So we come down here in this block of code, and I say this dot close, just like you're normally used to seeing. Notice I did use the extra braces here. I didn't need to, because there's only one line of code. Otherwise, if they pick no, then I'm going to come down here and say, hey, message box show, make up your mind, okay? And I put a question mark there. I could have put the exclamation mark. In fact, I'll change that. Let me show you how to change that. So if we want to show them that we're a little frustrated with their silly response, I can make that an exclamation mark, and now when it comes up, it's going to look like, hey, make up your mind for sure. All right, both of these scenarios, I did not need the braces only because there's one line of code in this block and one line of code in this block. But as I said, I typically use those. Okay, so make sure that you try this for yourself and that you understand what's going on. But this is a nice little example of how you get something back from Mr. Messagebox, how you get an answer back and get a response. This is very, very common. You'll do this a lot. All right, now let's go up here to my form load event for a second, and let's take a look at how I test to see if the network is up and running, okay? And again, I used a block if scenario. I have an if and I have an else block. So if what I'm testing in the parentheses is true, and it's going to do a message box that says, hey, your computer's connected to the network, we have a little message, we got OK buttons, I got information. Otherwise, if it's not, I'm going to say your network is not up and running. We're going to have the same system message box. I'm going to have an OK button. That's cool. And then I'm going to use the exclamation icon, sort of like I did before. Here's what I want to show you in the if statement, though. When you look at the beginning of your form up here, you'll notice that there are a few namespaces, really only two, that we're using right now, and these include all the things we need to do a Windows desktop application. I told you that I want you to know this namespace because everything that has to do with a form, including all the controls and including the message box, by the way, are inside this namespace. If I took this out right now, I not only couldn't make a form, but I couldn't do a message box, I couldn't use my controls. So that's where all that stuff is. The system namespace is kind of where it holds all the stuff to talk to Windows to even make this application run at all. So that's like, if you don't have that, then you can't even start. So you always have that. These other ones are ones that are put in by Visual Studio, but in my particular case here, we're not accessing them and we're not using them. But that's fine, we'll just leave it there. Now let's go into the form load event again, and let me show you how I check to see if the network is up. And I want you to write this down somewhere because I doubt very seriously if this is in your book. Here's what I did. I discovered some time ago in searching around that the code and the features that allow us to check network thing and to ping a computer or to find out what its name is on the network and stuff is inside the system.net namespace. And I could have gone up here and typed in using system.net, okay? But I didn't. I wanted to just show you that you can access features in other namespaces that are on your hard drive when you need them simply by typing in what is called the fully qualified namespace. This is the whole namespace starting with system.net. Now inside system.net there's another thing called network information. When you do system.net, let me show you, and you do a dot, you get all kinds of stuff. You can check for authorization. You can check configuration. You can figure out if it's a cookie or not. You can check for DNS. Now that's dynamic naming system to see if your computer is working on DNS. I mean, there is tons and tons of stuff, of network stuff. But what I was looking for in this particular case was just network information. There he is, okay? And then when you do another dot, you get something called a network interface. And would you please write down, this network interface is referring to your network card or your wireless network chip if you're using Wi-Fi. It says, hey, go to that device that's normally used to get to the network and tell me, is the network available? Now this is a method you can see here. It's sort of like an action word, but it has the two parentheses after it. Make sure you put those parentheses in, it won't work. Get is network available. Now Microsoft went to a lot of work to reduce this down to one line of code for us. In the old days you would have had to do a lot of stuff to find out if the network was running, but they make it easier and easier all the time. This may not look easy to you, but trust me, it's easy. So we're going to say if it's true, double equals, don't forget that, you're going to mess that up until you get used to it. If it's true that the network is available, then go ahead and say, hey, your computer's connected to the network. Good, that's it. Now, if this is true, you guys, if the if statement evaluates as true, it never comes down here and looks at this. It would be a waste of time. If it's true, it does this and it's done testing and it jumps down here to see if it's supposed to do anything else. There's nothing for it to do, so it just sits there. This message box goes away and your form becomes visible because this is in the form load event. So before you even see the form, remember when I push F5, you get this guy. Then when I say OK, now you see the form. Okay, that's how it works. Now in both these cases you'll notice I did not use the braces this time because I wanted to show you I've only got one line of code or one command. Even though I broke it up into two lines here, it's still only one big command, one semicolon, and this guy here is only one big command. I just simply broke it up so you could see it better on the screen. So there's no reason to use the curly braces. So in this little project, even though it was a little simple thing, I've shown you how to validate a text box with this code right here. It's not the only way. Let me show you another way. You can say if it's not equal to double quotes. That's very, very common. Okay, that means if there's nothing in there, if there's no letters, remember how I showed you could clear a label by setting its text property to double quotes? Well, this is just saying, hey, if there's nothing in there because it's two double quotes, then tell them to put their name in there. Okay, so that's a very common way to do that. The kind of the new .NET way is to use this string.empty method, empty property, and let it see if there's something in there. And we've learned that when you use an if statement, you type it in. Whatever you're evaluating has to be in rounded parentheses. The if statement is going to just check, is it true or not true? If it's true, it will evaluate and, it will execute the block of code that you have right underneath this if statement. It's going to do the very first one. If you have more than one command here, like I do here, you must use the two curly braces. Okay? Now, if you don't put those in and you have 2 blocks of code, you're going to get a funny error. So you just have to learn some of these rules. And if you do it a few million times, you kind of get the hang of it. And if this is true, it quits testing. It's going to run down here and see if there's anything else to do. Nothing else to do. It never evaluates this and this at the same time. The only reason it's going to execute this line of code is if there was nothing in here. It's very important that you understand how it behaves. Now the quit button, again, we use to get an answer back from the message box, and we just put what we normally do for a message box, like I did up here, we encapsulate it inside of an if statement. So we said if, and then we put a parentheses there. You got to have a left parentheses there. You got to have one at the end. There he is. Okay, they have to match, just like in algebra. And we now know that message boxes are dialog boxes, so after you tell it to put a yes/no button in and a question mark for the icon, you can evaluate whether or not they picked yes or no. You always just test to see if they picked yes. You don't ever have to do this again and say, else if they pick dialog result no, do this. Okay? You don't test it like that. You just simply say, if this is true, quit. Otherwise, do this, because we know if this is not true, they had to pick no. Okay, so you don't waste your time coming down here again and saying, else if the message is no, do this. That would be just a waste of your typing and slow your program down, so there's no reason to do that. Okay, so make sure that you understand what these things are and get up to speed with it and practice with it. The last thing is, of course, with our constructor, I told you this is a place where there's a block of code that has the same name as our form. Anytime you see a block of code that has the same name, FRM main, I called it that, as our form, that is called a constructor. And inside the constructor is where the form, in this case, is actually constructed. That's why they call it that. And they do that because Visual Studio created this method called initializeComponent. I showed you before, but I'll show you real quick again. It's underneath your form. You go into Form 1 Designer, and you'll see here where it says Windows Generated Code. You see a method, a block of code called initializeComponent, and this is where it adds all our buttons, puts on the properties. Remember that? I showed you that. That's what that is for. So it goes ahead and runs all that and creates our form in memory, but that's not visible yet. And then the next thing that happens is it goes to see if there's anything in the form load event that it should do. If there's no form load event, then it just shows the form. It does it automatically. If there is a form load event, it will execute all of that first before the form is visible, and then it shows the form. So this is why we use the form load event to load things in list boxes and do all kinds of things. You'll use that a lot. All right. Now this project is on your website, so I would suggest you download it, look at it, study it. I tried to put a lot of comments, and I would greatly encourage you to build one yourself from scratch. All right. Thank you.